In this section, I'd like to cover the basics of automating a web browser because getting data in and out of web browsers is a very common practice in many enterprise processes. The steps we're going to cover include using Orchestrator to manage our browser assets. So the first thing we'll do is get our assets from the Orchestrator, including the URL and credentials. Then we'll open the browser to some kind of a login page. We'll type and submit our credentials. And after this, we could examine the browser page to make sure that we landed in the right spot. And finally, I'll show you how to close the browser. So let's dive right in. To keep things simple to begin with, let's pretend that the process we want to automate is going to Amazon.com, signing into the website, performing a search, and examining what the top non-sponsored product is. We don't actually need to sign in to perform this search, but I wanted to show you how to sign in and sign out because many other web-based processes require this. Before I even open UiPath and create a project, what I would always do first is start in Orchestrator and capture my URL and credentials as assets. So you might think that the URL we're going to capture is Amazon.com. But if we do that, it will force us to have to perform extra steps to hover over this, click on sign in, and then begin the sign in process. What I would rather do, instead of forcing myself to interact with all these hover controls, which can be problematic, is I'm simply going to right click on this sign in button and select the properties menu item. And then I'm going to click and drag and select this entire address URL and copy that, because that's ultimately the destination that I want to get to start my sign in. So I jump over into UiPath Orchestrator, click on Assets, then click the plus sign to add a new asset. I'm expecting that multiple robots will interact with the Amazon website, so I'm going to namespace this as global.amazon-site-URL, and the word global just means it's not restricted to any one robot. I'll leave the type as text, and I'll simply Control-V to paste in that login URL we captured from the browser. Click on Add, and I've got my Amazon site URL asset. I already know the credentials that I want to use, so I'll click plus again, and I'll call the credentials global.amazon-site-credentials. And I'm going to change this type to credential, and that allows me to type in the username, which is simply my email address, and the password, which will be encrypted on the server. Click Add, and now I have my two Amazon site assets. Now I'll jump over to UiPath, click here to start a blank project. I'll call it Browser Automation. Copy and paste that into the description. Saving in C, Development UiPath, and click Create. You've already seen in the Orchestrator section how I was able to get assets and open a browser. So this will be a little bit of review. First thing I'll do is jump into my activities and grab a try-catch, because that's what I tend to use as my top-level activity. Drag that into the canvas, and I'll just rename this to Try the Whole Process. As you may recall from the exception handling section, we need to have a catch down here, so I'll click on Add New Catch, and catch the generic exception, and click in this white space. And when I catch an exception, I'm simply going to use a message box. So I'll click and drag that into my exception activity area, open my quotes, say something bad happened, colon, space, and then I'll add a plus to concatenate my exception. I'll copy the word exception, add an extra space, paste dot message. So by using dot message, I'll simply be displaying the inner message that was contained inside my exception in this message box, which is really not that much different than what UiPath does out of the box, but having it set up in a try-catch like this gives me the freedom to handle the exception in a more elegant way in the future. So I'll click back up here on my try block to collapse my catch and expand my try block. Now we're actually ready to do our browser work. I'm going to break up my interaction with the web browser into several different sections, and I want to use sequences to accomplish that. The thing we have to remember about our try block is that it only accepts one activity. So what I'll do first is click on the Activities pane here, type in SEQ to filter for sequences, then click and drag one sequence into my try block. And I'll name this the whole process. So you can see that my try-catch block says we're going to try the whole process, and if it fails, we're going to present a message box. Inside the try the whole process, we've got a sequence called the whole process. So inside there is where I'll add more sequences to do my work. So I'll drag in 1, 2, 3 sequences. I'll rename this one Get Assets. I'll name this one Open Browser and Login. I'll name this one Close Browser. In a future video, I'm going to add another sequence in between Open Browser and Close Browser, but for now this is fine. As a review from the Orchestrator Assets section, we're going to get the assets we need to be able to open the browser. So I will click on Activities, type in ASSETS to filter my assets, and we're going to need one Get Asset and one Get Credential. So I'll click and drag that here, and once more I'll click and drag my credentials there. Just for clarity, I'm going to go ahead and rename this Get Site URL, and I'll name this Get Credentials. Over here in Orchestrator, we've got our two assets, so I'm going to select and Control-C my site URL, click on Get Site URL, and I'm going to click on these 3 buttons here just to give myself some more space. For this activity, it's asking for a string, so I'll open my double quotes and use Control-V to paste, making sure I use the delete key to get rid of that extra space that came in. Click OK. And of course we need to click down here in the output value area and right click to create a variable. I'll call this site URL and hit return. Now in doing that, if I click down here on my variables tab, you can see that it created a new variable for us. It's of type generic, but its scope is only get assets, which is this activity here. We want to make sure that we can use that variable in other activities like open browser and log in, so we need to increase the scope of this to the whole process. I'll close the variables window, and now let's go get the credentials. So back in Orchestrator, I drag and Control-C on Amazon Site Credentials, click on this activity, and this time I'll just click in the asset name field here and open my double quotes, Control-V to paste. Go all the way to the end to make sure we don't have an extra space, and we don't. That's good. Now, of course, we need to supply 2 variables for username and password. And be careful when you're dealing with these. The intuitive thing to me would be to have username on top and password on the bottom. Sometimes I screw those up, so just pay attention to what you're doing. So here I'll right-click to create a variable for username, call this site username, and hit return. Right-click in here, call this site password, hit return. And since we've got this credentials activity selected, we'll go to the variables. Notice we have those 2 new variables. Username is a string, site password is secure string, but again, the scope is limited to get assets, so we need to change that to the whole process. There we go. Close variables, and that's all we need to do to get the assets we need for opening the browser and logging in. We'll deal with that in the next video. So now, as part of the whole process we're working on to interact with the browser, we've finished up our Get Assets activity, which grabs our URL and credentials from Orchestrator. I decided what I want to do is, instead of using a sequence here, I'm going to select and copy this name, and then right-click to delete this sequence. I'm going to go into my activities and search for flowchart. And I'm going to click and drag the flowchart in where that sequence used to be. I'll click on the name, select, paste to rename it, and now you can see I have a flowchart instead of a sequence. As you can see, it says here we need to double-click to view it. So when I double-click, you see our breadcrumbs show that we're in main, try the whole process, and now we're in our flowchart called Open Browser and Login. The reason why I'm selecting a flowchart is because in a future video, we're going to build a retry mechanism for opening the browser and logging in. So if for some reason the browser doesn't open or our login fails, we can try like 3 times instead of just failing and giving up. So aside from this flowchart, dealing with the browser should be very similar to the orchestrator assets section we looked at previously. I'll go into Activities, type Browser, and we see all these things we can do from opening and attaching, navigating, and refreshing. So of course the one we want is to click and drag Open Browser into our flowchart. I'll hover over my Start node and drag my arrow from Start to Open Browser. And when I click on Open Browser, you can see it's asking me what URL do I want to use. So of course now I can just click in there, start typing in SIT, and you see that my site URL variable shows up. So I double click on that. When I click away, notice that warning goes away. The only other thing I need to do is make sure that the correct browser is going to open. In this case, I do want to use IE, so I'll leave that selected. And we're good to go. If I use my breadcrumb to go back to the whole process, you can see that we're first going to get assets. Then we're going to jump into this flowchart where we open the browser. We'll deal with logging in the next video. All we have to do now is close the browser. But first, let's run the robot to make sure it works. I'm going to close up the instance of Amazon we have in the background and click on the play button to run. You can see that UiPath did its job and then ended and returned back to the IDE. So when I minimize UiPath, you can see in the background, IE has opened and navigated to our sign-in URL. And it's ready and waiting for us to enter the credentials. I'm going to close this up for now, and let's go back into UiPath and talk about how to close that browser. Here in the flowchart where we open the browser, I'm going to double click, and I'm going to click on my Open Browser activity. If I scroll down to the bottom of the Properties window, you see there's this Output field. And what this does is it allows me to store a variable that represents the open browser window. So I'm going to click in here and right click, say Create New Variable, and I'll just call this the browser and hit Return. And when I go and examine my variables window, you can see I now have the browser variable. And if I drag this out a little bit, you see that the type is of type browser, which is good, but the scope is only open browser and login. We want that variable to span all the way down to the close browser activity, so I'm going to click on this and set the scope to the whole process. Close up my variables, and now I'll use my breadcrumbs to jump back to the whole process and scroll down to close browser. For this activity, I'll click on the Activities pane, and I'm going to select this Close Tab activity and drag that in. You can see what Close Tab is asking us for is the browser page that you want to close. And when you hover over it, it says this field supports only browser variables. Well, you may recall we just created a browser variable. So if I click in here and start typing THE, you can see there's our browser variable. So I'll double click on that, and that's all Close Tab needs to be able to close the browser. So that we can see this process happen, I'm temporarily going to drag a delay in here. So I'll go back to Activities, type in delay, and then click and drag this delay right above Close Tab. And for my duration, I'll type 00:00:, let's just say 05 for 5 seconds. And that's it. We are now getting assets, opening a browser, and capturing a variable that represents that browser, waiting 5 seconds, and then closing that browser. Let's run it and watch. Browser opens, goes to the sign-in page, waits 5 seconds, closes the browser, and we're back to UiPath. Simple as that. Now that we're successfully opening and closing the browser, even though it's not required for our search, let's figure out how we can log in. The login is going to be contained inside this flowchart along with Open Browser, so we can easily retry in case things fail. So let's double click to go inside this flowchart. I'm going to rename this Open Browser and Login. And you can see when you hover over it, it says it's a container that enables you to open a browser at a specified URL and execute multiple activities within it. So this is an atomic container that's going to open the browser and allow me to log in as well. So within this sequence, once we log in, we can also check for something on the web page that indicates that we've logged in, and we can set a Boolean variable to true or false if that's there, and then use some kind of a conditional to determine whether we need to go back and try the login again if it didn't work. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's just double click on this Open Browser and log in. And there's our do sequence where we're going to put our login stuff. UiPath does offer a recorder up here that allows you to do web recording. I'm going to cover that in a future video, but I often prefer to build up my sequences manually instead of using the recorder. UiPath makes that very intuitive as well. So let's try it out. Most of the work you do in browsers is going to involve clicking and input text. So as part of our login, the first thing we're going to have to do is enter our username. And I'm going to jump back in here to my assets, select and copy that sign-in URL so I can navigate to that site and have it open in the background, because this is going to help me gather up my sign-in activities. So you can see the first thing it's asking us for is to type in our email. For that, we can use an activity called type into. So I jump back into UiPath, click on activities, enter the phrase type, and you can see we have our type into right there. So I'll click and drag that into my do, and I can rename this to login. So this is where things get cool. My type into activity provides me with this link that says indicate element inside browser. So I'm going to make sure that my instance of IE is ready in the background. And when I click on this link, it minimizes UiPath so I can see the browser. Now I can hover my cursor around over various elements, and I can click the cursor on the element that I want to type into. And when I do that, you can see that it captured a screenshot so we can tell which field we're typing into. And over here in the Properties pane, when I click on that type into activity, you can see we've got this thing called a target. It's important to expand that, scroll down a bit, and this selector is what we're most interested in. When I click on these three dots, you can see the selector that UiPath captured from the browser that represents that email text box. You can see it's a web control with an ID of app_email, and the tag type is an input. If you don't understand what that stuff is, be sure to check out my RPA Tech Primer course, because I go through web selectors and locators in that course. For now, I'll just click OK and trust that UiPath did the right thing. And now, of course, I need to supply the text that's going to be typed into that text box. So I click in here, and you may recall that we have site assets that represent our credentials. So I'll start typing SITE, and you can see that I've got my site username and password. So I'll double click on site username, and as I hover over it, we can see that's already a string, so I don't need to use .toString. While I'm here, I'm going to click on this and change this to type the username. And one last thing I tend to do with all these web activities is to scroll down here and find the timeout milliseconds. And I'll usually enter something like 3000 milliseconds in there, because the default is like 30 seconds. And if UiPath can't find the web element, it takes a long time before the robot will stop. So I like having 3-second timeouts on most of my web elements. So going back to the browser, the next thing we have to do is click on this continue button. So I'm going to temporarily type in my username, so when we do click on this button, it'll go to the next page. You might have guessed that the next activity we need is a click. So I'm going to click on my activities and type in the word click here. And you can see up towards the top, we've got UI automation, element, mouse click. We do have some other clicks, but that's for OCR and image and so on. So I'm going to click and drag this click underneath my type into activity. And again, you see that it provides us with this indicate element inside browser. So I can make sure that my browser is available behind UiPath, and I can click on that link and then hover over the button I want to click on and click it. You can see again it captured a little screenshot of that control, and again over here in the properties window it captured a target as well. And if I click on those three buttons, we can see that again it's a web control with an ID of continue, and the tag again is of type input. So I'll click OK to accept that. I'll enter my 3000 millisecond timeout, and that's it. We now have a button click. To keep things pretty, I'll go ahead and rename this to click continue. Now jumping back to the browser, I will click on the continue button, and now we have our password field and a sign in button. So you probably think right off the bat, we need another type into activity and a click activity. You're close. Since this is a password, we need a slightly different activity called type secure text. And of course, we'll use a click for this one. So let's go add those. Back to UiPath, open up Activities, enter Type, and you can see this is the one we're looking for, Type Secure Text. So I'll click and drag that underneath the Continue button, and again we have this nice blue link that allows us to indicate the element inside the browser. So I make sure that the browser is available behind UiPath, and I click that link. When I click on Password, you can see it captures the screenshot, and over here in the Properties window, we've got a new selector with an ID of AP_password. Since that selector is an ID and doesn't appear to be dynamic, we should be okay, so I'll click on OK. And now we have to make note of the fact that this Type Secure Text activity is a little different than the normal Type Into activity. With Type Into, we have the ability to supply the value we're typing down here at the bottom. Whereas with Type Secure Text, we don't have that. So we have to jump up here into the Properties pane and look for this Input section where it gives us an opportunity to put the secure text. So we already have a variable for this, and I'll start typing SITE, and you can see I can just double click on Site Password, and if I hover over that, the label says that it's already a secure string, and that's exactly what this activity is expecting. So the last thing I'll do is add my 3000 millisecond timeout, and then click in the title here to rename this to Type Password. On the browser, we still need to click on this Sign In button, so I'm going to make sure that browser window is active behind UiPath, and I'll click on Activities, type in Click, and in the same area up here, UI Automation Element Mouse Click, I will click and drag a click underneath Type Password. As usual, we have this nice blue Indicate Element Inside Browser, so I'll click on that, and I'll hover my cursor over the Sign In button and click. So it takes a screenshot, and when we look at our target selector, we've got a web control with an ID that doesn't look dynamic, so that's good. I'll click OK. And I'll just draw your attention to the fact that here in the properties, if for some reason we wanted to do a double click or right click, we could. Notice click type. I can select single, double, down, or up. And for mouse button, I can use left, right, or middle. The defaults are fine though. So let's toss in our 3000 millisecond delay and rename this to Click Sign In. So to recap, in this open browser activity, we're passing in the site URL variable. Then we've got a sequence for logging in where we're going to use Type Into with the site username variable. Then we'll click the Continue button with a single left click. Then we'll use Type Secure Text to type in this password variable we have. And finally, we'll do one more single left click to complete the sign in. So now I'll jump back into the browser, enter my password, and click on Sign In the way automation would, so that we can get the browser into a state that will allow us to sign out. Again, I'm going to take the easy way out to sign out. The way a human would do it would be to hover over this, and then scroll down to the bottom and click on this sign out link. I'm simply going to right click on this and use Properties, and then drag and select this entire address all the way to the end, Control-C to copy. And to prove that that works, I'll just click up here and Control-V to paste and hit return. So notice that takes us back to the sign-in page. So I'll close up the browser to get ready for our test run. Back here in UiPath, I'll use the breadcrumb to jump back to the whole process. We've just completed open browser and log in. We're already waiting 5 seconds after the browser opens, just so we can see what's going on. So now I'm going to go to Activities, type in Browser again, and I've got a URL, so I want to use this Navigate activity to go to that URL. I'll click and drag that after the delay, and I'll rename this Navigate to Sign Out page. And it's asking for a string that must be quoted, so I'll click in here and open my double quotes, and Control-V to paste that whole URL. When I click away, the warning goes away, but I want to draw your attention to the fact that when I do click on this and go to the Properties window, you can see we are giving it a URL, but there's another input here that it's not complaining about, but is a great idea to pass along. So when I hover over that, it says, this is the browser in which you want to navigate to the specific page, and it says this field supports only browser variables. A browser variable is simply a placeholder in memory that knows which browser window we're talking about. So you may recall that inside here in our open browser and log in, when I click on this open browser activity, down near the bottom, we created a browser variable that holds a reference to the browser window we opened. So now that I know that variable, and I know that that variable has a high enough scope to be seen outside of this activity, I can jump back into the whole process scroll down here to my navigate activity, click in there and just start typing the to allow my IntelliSense to show that variable. So now when I double click on it, this activity knows which browser to use for navigating to this URL. Now the last thing I'll mention here is that when you're automating browsers, you always have to remember that browser activities might take some time to execute. So we're using this close tab activity to close the browser, but I don't want to run the risk of the browser tab closing before this sign out activity has a chance to complete. So I'm simply going to copy and paste that delay after I navigate to the sign out page, and maybe I'll reduce this to like 3 seconds before I close my tab. So to summarize, we have a sequence for the whole process, and we have a nested sequence called getAssets, where we're going to talk to Orchestrator and get our site URL and our credentials, which is a username and password, and all of those things are being stored as variables that have a scope of the whole process. Inside here, we're going to open the browser and capture a browser variable. We're navigating directly to the sign-in link and providing our username and password and clicking the sign-in buttons. And then here in this closed browser sequence, we're going to wait and watch to make sure it loads. Then we'll navigate to the sign-out page, wait another 3 seconds, then close the tab. Let's run the robot and watch it work. Clicking play up here in the top left, browser opens, type in the username, type in the password, click sign in, wait 5 seconds, navigate to the sign out page, and then close the tab. Let's try it one more time to make sure it works again. Opens the browser, types in the username, clicks continue, password, sign in, waits 5 seconds on the landing page, goes to the sign out page, then closes the tab. So there you go. Open browser, sign in and sign out, and close browser is working fine. So from our previous lectures, we now have a robot that tries to do a whole process, which first gets assets from Orchestrator, including the URL and credentials, then goes into a flowchart to open the browser and log in, and then has a sequence which navigates to a sign out page and closes the browser. Let's add something between opening the browser and logging in and closing the browser, because we've got to do some work inside the browser, right? Since I anticipate the work we're going to do being a linear sequence, I'll type in sequence here and click and drag a sequence right after our open browser. And I'll click to rename this search for a product. Now inside this sequence, we're going to be interacting with the browser that was already opened here in this flowchart activity. You may recall that to open the browser, we used an open browser activity. So of course here, when we perform some work, we're not going to want to open the browser again, but we do want to make sure that whatever activities we perform are occurring on the correct browser. So the way we do that is to go here to activities, and if we type in browser, you can see in our list there's an activity called attach browser, and that's exactly what we want. So this is a container that enables you to attach to an already open browser and perform multiple actions within it. Notice that it's automatically generated when you use the web recorder. We're not doing that, so we've got to drop it in manually. So I will click on that and drop it into my search for a product sequence. I'm going to control mouse wheel to zoom in a little bit here. Notice UiPath gives us this nice blue link here again to indicate which browser we want to attach to. And then there's a sequence that allows us to do some stuff after we've attached. So I'm going to click to open up IE again and just type in Amazon. And notice I've already signed in because it's important that for these next steps, the browser is in the condition that the robot is expecting. So I leave that browser visible. I jump back into UiPath, and inside my attach browser activity, I click on this blue link again, indicate browser on screen. So now you can see that the orange rectangle can either be in the client area of the browser or around the entire frame of the browser. It's important that you only click in this center client area and not the outside frame. So I'll simply click in here in the client area, and you can see just like in our previous type into and click, UiPath has captured a screenshot of the browser. And over here in our properties pane, if I click on the selector dots and expand this a little bit, you can see it shows a selector of HTML title equals Amazon.com and all this text. Now again, I cover this in more detail in the RPA Tech Primer course, but I don't want to leave all these words in here because Amazon likes to change their website a lot. what I'd like to do is select and delete all that text and simply replace it with an asterisk character. So now the robot is going to use the words Amazon.com in the title, and the asterisk represents any other text that might also be present. So that's fine, I'll click on OK. So now that we've attached to the browser, let's go down here into our do sequence and actually perform the search. So in the browser, you can see that we've got a text box into which we need to type some text. Then we're going to click on this image right here. So of course, we're going to need to type into activity and a click, just like we used for our sign-in. So I'll go back to UiPath and I'll enter type, and I'm going to click and drag a type into, and then I'll go back in here, enter click, and under UI automation element mouse click, I'll click and drag this underneath my type into. So now you can see we've got the activities for typing and clicking. While I'm here, I'll rename these briefly to type search keyword and click search icon. So you might already know by now that we need to make sure the browser is present, and then simply click on this link and click on the desired text box. Notice it captures our screenshot. We'll jump over here and look at the selector it chose. It's a web control ID of that. Input, that's fine. I'll enter my usual 3000 millisecond timeout. And for the text we're going to type in, I just click in here, open up my double quotes, type in my desired search text, and we should be good to go. For the search icon, we'll do the same thing. Click this link, hover and select that button. Over in the properties pane, we examine the selector it chose. In this case, it has a parent ID of nav search. Our tag is input of type submit. That's fine. Enter my 3000 millisecond timeout. And again, you could use 2000 or 5000 or whatever you want. Really kind of depends on how fast your site loads. And that's really about it. We now have a sequence that will attach to the browser, type a keyword in the search text box, click the search icon, and then it's going to wait for this 5 seconds before it navigates to our logout and closes the browser. So let's make sure that we're signed out of the browser and close it up and then run the robot and see if it works. So it opens the browser, types the email, clicks continue, types the password, signs in, typing the keyword, clicking on that search icon, and we've got our results. Now it waits 5 seconds and closes the browser. Excellent. The robot does exactly what we planned. So in a future video, I'll show you how to take advantage of the recorder to do things like this. But I personally only use the recorder as a guide. I tend to more often manually drag in the activities I know I'm going to need and build them up in this way that I just demonstrated, because that gives me an opportunity to set my timeouts, examine the selectors, and replace these various inputs with my desired variables. In this case, we're not using a variable for our search keyword, but in a future video, I'll show you how to create a reusable workflow and pass a variable in for our search keyword. So hopefully now you get a better sense of how you can use these browser activities to open a browser, and that also will navigate you to your starting URL. Then you can use your click activity or your type into activity, and notice there are other text activities like element get text. You can actually use that to grab text off the browser. We've got our click and our type into, and of course back here on browser, you can navigate to a different URL, attach to the browser in different activities, and then eventually close the tab. So hopefully that gives you a great overview of the basics of interacting with a browser. In this lecture, I'd like to talk about something that will most likely trip you up at least once, and I can pretty much guarantee you that no other RPA course will go to this kind of detail. So pay close attention because you'll most likely see this in your RPA career. In one of the enterprise software robots I've built, there's a process that needs to interact with a Wells Fargo bank site to download a log of wire transfers so that they can be processed into a back-end workflow system. There's a great chance you'll experience something like this, so let me walk through it quickly and you can see what kind of problems I faced and how to solve them. So the robot logs into this Wells Fargo bank site and then clicks on this Quick Reports button right in the middle. Now you'll notice that opened up a second tab. Then the robot continues on to download both this PDF file and this BAI file. Notice what happens when I click on this BAI file button. you see that it opened up yet a third tab and is downloading the file to our local hard drive. I'm using a Chrome browser to accomplish this because when I tried to use Internet Explorer, it would pop up that file download toolbar down at the bottom of the window, and that's actually a whole separate window outside of the browser that requires you to take a desktop automation approach to interact with it. And it's just too complicated for downloading a file. What's nice about Chrome is that you can go into these settings, scroll down to the bottom, click on Advanced, scroll to the bottom of Advanced, and there's this download section where you can specify where you want the files to go. And you can turn off this toggle here that says Ask Where to Save. So the end result of specifying a location and turning off this checkbox is that this file will automatically be downloaded to C downloads, and your robot doesn't have to do anything to interact with it. So back to the problem at hand, you can see that 2 different windows were popped up during this process. And you can see that when I click on these links, everything works just fine. The windows pop up and the files download as you would expect. So let me close this Chrome window and run the robot and see if it'll work. So here you get a sense of what the robot is going to do. It's going to open the browser and log in, try to download a PDF file, then try to download that BAI file, then it would close the browser windows, rename and move the files from that C downloads directory that I talked about. And in the process of moving them, it's going to check to see if the files exist at the destination. If for any reason the download or rename and move activities fail, the BAI file will not exist at the destination, and this decision will notice that. If the BAI file does not exist, you can see that it's going to go back up to the top here, check whether we've attempted 3 times, and if not, it'll start the process over again. After the 3rd time, it'll throw an exception. The important thing to pay attention to as a new robot developer is trying to download this PDF and trying to download that BAI file. Let's run the robot and see what happens. It has opened the browser. It's logging in. Now it's clicking on that Quick Reports button. And now watch, it'll try to click that PDF link. And then you'll see the BAI2 button show up. But notice that nothing popped up. Do you see why? When the robot finishes, I click in the output here. You can see that it signs on, clicks on Quick Reports, then clicks on the PDF link and waits, then clicks on the BAI link and waits. So those link clicks are succeeding, but the window for downloading the files never popped up. So what's the deal there? You saw it succeed when I did it manually, and I'll show you again. I click on Quick Reports, I click on BAI, and notice it works fine when I do it manually. So why can't the robot do it? This time I'll run the robot and I'll stop it when it gets to the point that it's failing to click these links. So the robot is running, it's signing in, clicking Quick Reports, and now you'll see it's attempting to click on that PDF link. And you saw it before, when it tries to click on BAI, that also fails. Let me try to click it manually. Notice that it works for me manually, and that would make you think to yourself that there must be something you're doing wrong as a robot developer. Well, here's what you would be missing. If you were paying attention up here in the top right, when the robot first tried to click on PDF, the words pop-up blocked appears up here. And notice that we've got this little nondescript icon that you'd almost never notice if you weren't paying attention closely, and it says pop-ups were blocked on this page. So for some reason, pop-ups on a page will work when you click on them manually, but the robot service is somehow perceived as a different kind of user, and the browser feels that it needs to suppress pop-ups for that user. So what you do is you click on this icon, and it tells you the following pop-ups were blocked on this page. It gives you a link, which unfortunately you can't right-click on, and gives you a choice to continue blocking or always allow from this URL. But just bear in mind, when links aren't working, and you know that the target is a new tab that pops up, keep your eyes peeled for that icon right there, and be sure to click on it, and click on the Manage button here. And where that takes you, if you need to get there on your own, is to Settings, and then scroll to the bottom, click on Advanced, scroll down into the bottom here, Content Settings, and then scroll down a little bit further in Content Settings till you see pop-ups. Now we're back on that Manage page. And now what you can do is click on this Add button and add in any kind of URL here you want to prevent that pop-up from being blocked. And as you can see, they give you a model here where you could potentially use a wildcard **whateverdomain.com to allow any subdomains from that domain to not be blocked. The other way to do it is just to click on that link and select Always Allow Pop-ups. And as you can see, this URL was already in that management dialog because I had selected this radio box already. So let's close up this browser and run the robot one more time to see what happens. It launches the browser, signs in, clicks on Quick Reports, clicks PDF, and notice that window popped up. And now we have the BAI window popping up as well, not blocked. Browser closes, and the robot moves on to its next objective. So long story short, when links aren't working and you know they lead to a pop-up, be sure to watch for that pop-up blocker dialog wherever it may appear, and it might be different in different browsers.